Hey, welcome to Everyday Torah. I'm Trevor, of course, and this is Gary. Probably needs no introduction to most of you, but Gary's been a long time, I don't know, teacher, mentor to me, and I really enjoyed listening to his stuff. One of the reasons I started this YouTube channel, Gary, was to preserve in perpetuity these sorts of things because, we talk about it, but just to preserve it for even myself and others is so important to me. So anyway, today we are taking a look at the book of Hebrews and its authorship. And one of the things that kept happening, I think, in our previous podcast, Gary, is you kept referring to the Apostle Paul as the author of Hebrews. And sometimes it did sound like you're pretty emphatic about this. And then we got some comments. And you and I had already had discussions, so you and I were comfortable with the idea, but some of the viewer listeners, they're just like, I don't know if anyone really knows. And you and I understand that there is not any decisive evidence in this regard. But at the same time, you and I came across that article. I think it was I don't know when it was published. I'll put the link below.
It's been about a decade now. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, yeah. Things move slow in this area, though. So a decade is like a blip of time.
Well, that is
in this kind of business,
in this area. Yes, not in the social media world, but
no. Even in my discipline in physics, a decade is like an eternity.
True.
Things move very fast in physics.
Well, anyway, the bottom line in that article is in the same way I think you would do handwriting analysis. These guys, they put together an analysis of textual evidence to see the language patterns, to see how consistent that was with the various authors. And they pinned it on Paul. So there's actually some scientific evidence. Pointing in that direction.
That's correct. Yeah. And in fact, I sort of titled this podcast, Who Wrote the Book of Hebrews? An Intriguing Answer. Ooh. So the answer is actually even more intriguing than that. And that's the thing that really captivated me when I looked at the articles, when you do get the analysis, and we'll talk about that analysis in more detail next time in the second part of this. But when you really look at it closely and you look at what was discovered in their analysis and how well that corresponds to early church testimony about this, then you scratch your head and go, wait a minute. When you see that kind of chains of evidence kind of coming together in harmony, that's pretty significant. And so we'll get into that in more detail that will help to unravel this entire problem of the book of Hebrews a little more fully. And it's to me, it's somewhat exciting, and that's why, I look at it almost as a scientist, and in our work in science, when we see the convergence, of experiment with theory. That's a big deal. That is a big deal in science. And that's kind of almost what's happened here in a certain sense.
So tell the listener, why am I going to dedicate an hour or two to this? Why do we even care who wrote it? I mean, we know that Yeshua died on the cross for sins, rose from the dead, high priest. Okay, who cares who wrote it?
Yes, and I think there's some good answers to that. The first thing that, of course, authorship in the New Testament, we actually know, at least by declaration, by what's revealed in the text itself, who authored most of the books. There are a few that have been questioned, and Hebrews is one of them. And so in the New Testament period and in the early church history as well, authorship was a very important question. The authority and the authenticity, if you will, of the message was rooted very much in who wrote the books. And this is very clear. And in fact, I'm not an expert in the canon, although one day I would like to become more so. I'd like to learn more about, the development of the canon in a much broader general sense. I've learned bits and pieces over the years, just in addressing certain issues. But it's very clear when you look at this early testimony that the people regarded who authored the book as extremely important to authenticating its message and giving it the authority that we should give it.
Yeah, even
as believers.
For me, I would say that if it appears that Paul wrote it, that would lend quite a bit of credibility.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Knowing the author just would do that intrinsically, right? Because we know that Paul, there's no question about his faith. There's no question about the authority that he carried as an apostle. And so that really would help us. In addition, one other aspect to this whole question that I think is very interesting, and I think looking at the issues of the canon in general also would fit in this rubric, that you have when you start asking questions like this, it brings out things that are unanticipated. And it gives sometimes a fullness to the document that it did not have previously. I've discovered this, and you alluded to it, I think in a remark, maybe it was off camera, that you made, that when you talk about, just knowing who these people were, right? Knowing who Paul is, what kind of a man was he, is very, I think, essential, as I've discussed previously as well, to understanding his message. You have to know the man. And some of these things, as you begin to dig into him deeper, you start to flesh out a little bit, some background information that gives you greater insight into the man himself and into the circumstances of the writing and all these other related issues that can give you a better understanding of both what was written. And by the way, it also influences other writings of his. If he was the author of Hebrews, let's face it, it's going to tell you a lot about his basic theological constructions, how he understood things, because Hebrews is a deep book. It's one of his deepest books. I mean, arguably Romans and Hebrews may be his greatest works if he was the author of Hebrews, in very different ways that in which he communicates his ideas and ties them together. So it's going to tell us a lot about him that may even influence how we understand those other books, Romans, Corinthians.
Right.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, I do.
So there's that dimension as well. And that's why these authorship questions, I think, are of extreme importance. To be honest with you, and until I read this article, it's been now some years back that I read it, I've always had on authorship issues a little bit of a jaundiced view about how theologians and even sometimes historical linguists have come up with their conclusions, particularly in the Old Testament. I mean, look, there's just so much uncertainty, honestly, with this stuff. And people, I think, sometimes overreach in their conclusions, shall we say. I'll just be generous and put it that way. And certainly from my background as a scientist, I have to tell you, there are a lot of scientists that feel the same way, that sometimes in some of these other areas, people feel they have to come to a conclusion. So they kind of overreach getting there, and really the evidence does not warrant it. And as we're finding out with things like the documentary hypothesis, for instance, of the Torah in the Old Testament, there are a lot of reasons now to question that whole framework because of successive information that's become available, over the last 150 years. So I just sort of had this jaundiced view. That's all the way I can describe this about these
creative description.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. And but here, for the first time, when I became aware of kind of what are more modern attempts, and again, we'll talk more in detail about this specific issue next time. But when I became more aware of this, I all of a sudden realized, now we're talking. My feeling was, now we're really getting down to business. We're coming up with methods that actually look like they could work to help us sort out a lot of these questions that have vexed us for decades, if not centuries.
Okay. Well, I do want to reiterate, because I do think it's something that anyone who's a serious Bible student, over and over again, when you know that the arguments in a particular book are made by the same author,
Yes.
you can sometimes fill out an argument with another book. Just something as simple yesterday going through Thessalonians, knowing well that, okay, Paul went through Thessalonians, he got kicked out, and you have context here where he's trying to encourage those folks. I see it over and over again in the book of Romans, and especially with regard to how Paul handles the law, handles sin. There's so much crossover.
Yes.
It's just helpful to know.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get with it. Why? Right. What's the evidence here?
Okay. Well, let me first do this. I'm going to start off as I like to do, with an outline. So the basic outline for today is we'll look at some specific issues and some, both of a special nature and also of a general nature that will try to set a context and a framework for our entire discussion. And probably today, if I could summarize the points that we'll go over, it would be, why do we believe Paul wrote it? Why do many people believe Paul wrote it? Why was the early testimony of the church, though it was a little bit divided, I would say there was probably more weight that Paul wrote it than not, and that's why the book got serious consideration at the Nicene Council, because people felt that, well, wait, there's a lot to this book that is both on its own individual merits as well as potential authorship that would make a very strong case for it. So it was discussed, and it was decided to include it in the canon. So at least back in that time, which is a time a lot closer than we live to today, right? They came to that conclusion. So I think it's important for us to look at the framework of the book and elements about the book and about circumstances of its writing that could point to Paul as the author. So that would be kind of like what we'll do today. Okay. And then next time I'll look at some issues that have been raised, and I'm just briefly dispense with those because most of those can actually be easily dispensed with in my view. And then we'll go right to the analysis that has been done that's more recent, that I think is maybe one of the first truly credible works that has been done to address this question more fully. So today I'll talk a little bit about, I'll just start off with the big elephant in the room, in some people's minds, which is, why does the book start so differently than Paul's other epistles? He doesn't give his name as the author anywhere in the book that we have. And that's unusual because Paul, right up front, usually declares who he is, and then he usually provides some doxology to the Father and the Son in conjunction with that sort of kicks off what his topic is going to be in his epistle. And that's absent in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews just launches right in to the subject matter. And actually, personally, I kind of like it in the sense that it's very dramatic, how the author brings the information to us. It's almost like you're watching a play or something, where somebody comes in and launches right into the an introductory message, right? Introductory words right into the storyline. So it's different, and so we need to address it. Why is this one, if it is Paul that wrote the Hebrews, why is this introduction so very different than his other introductions in his other epistles? And since he has 14 that could be ascribed to him, that would mean 13 out of 14 are one way, and this one's the exception. So it's enough of an exception that we need to look at it. The next thing we'll do is we'll look at some issues of general style and personal information that's revealed in the book that are all consistent with Paul. And so consistency does not mean that he's the author, but when you have enough consistency in enough different areas, you certainly should step back and say, well, maybe we should take this seriously then, not just dismiss this information because no single piece is conclusive, but the sort of sum total of the pieces begins to paint a picture, doesn't it? It's kind of
and then the opposite would be true too. If everything else was consistent, but then one thing certainly wasn't, then that would send up a red flag.
That's exactly right.
But you're saying in your research, you don't see any red flags.
I don't see any red flags, and I will discuss some potential red flags next week, or next session, and that's what we'll do at the beginning, to assure people that these red flags are not as red as you might think.
Okay,
and, that type of thing.
Right.
And then go on to the analysis. So the last thing I'd like to do is and this is, of course, one might regard as more of a traditional approach to doing textual analysis, but in this case, I'm doing it because of the unusual nature of it. It's really quite striking. It's what I call the unique thematic similarities of Hebrews with the other epistles of Paul, and so and they're more than people imagine. And the nature of them, as well as the number of them, make this, I think, at least something that has to be put on the table as supportive evidence. And so we'll talk about that as well. So we'll just launch in then. What about this missing introduction of Paul? Because the author in Hebrews is not explicitly identified within the text itself. By the way, there are some traditions, I believe, with the Aramaic version, the Aramaic translation, where there is an appendage that's attached to it in the Peshitta, Syriac, a version of Hebrews, where there is an identification of Paul included, as I recall.
Okay.
But in the Greek text, I'm not aware that there is such an appendage to it. So we find the usual things in Paul's epistles missing, and as I mentioned earlier, the author just launches right into the subject matter. So that's different, and we should ask, I think, a few questions here as we begin to address a topic like this, because in my estimation, while this is an anomaly, and I would acknowledge it, is it the kind of anomaly that should immediately, upon which, I'll just put it this way, upon which you would just turn the conclusion and say, well, he didn't write it, and I don't think that's the case at all, and I'd like to briefly mention why that might be so, why this is certainly worthy of note, but it's not a turning point in our discussion at all. We know that the book of Hebrews, if it were written by Paul, and I think more and more people are beginning to understand that there are other things in the text itself that really point toward about the 60s AD, for the writing of Hebrews. Probably, the mid-60s would be a pretty good target date, but somewhere in that vicinity. It's not too much later, and it's probably not too much earlier than that. So There's a kind of window of time in which this was written. And in this part of the chronology, we know that Paul's life was very different than the earlier period of his life. Where he was sent to Rome to stand trial before Nero in the early 60s, we believe maybe in the neighborhood of 61 or so, 62 AD, and he was under house arrest for several years, perhaps. And then there's evidence that he was released, and then he was rearrested again, somewhere in the middle of the decade, 64, 65, 66, somewhere in there. And upon his rearrest, it becomes clear that he's not getting out. In fact, he's expecting his own death is imminent. That's sort of the basic picture that we have, or believe that we understand about Paul in his later life. So if Hebrews was written during the same time, I don't think it's difficult to imagine that there were circumstances surrounding the original release of Hebrews during this period that were very unsettled, if not chaotic. And we'll go into more detail about that in just a moment. And so this shift in circumstances that does occur, where he's out of jail, then he's back in jail, this kind of thing, could certainly have had some bearing on how the book was originally circulated. And that could have, in some manner, had an impact or influence on how the book was written, and perhaps on the way that the introduction was put together by the author. So it's not too hard to imagine scenarios, right? that could happen in a situation like this. He wasn't just back, sitting up in his mansion, writing stuff at his leisure. He was in circumstances that were probably pretty challenging during this period, and so we have to at least have that factored, I think, in the back of our minds when we look at questions like this. But I notice some people, looking at things like this are not as satisfying, even though they may be true. We don't know. So there are also considerations that I think that we should take into account, that the author himself may have intended that the epistle open as it did. I mean, that it was truly his original intention, and it wasn't background circumstances that influenced it at all. And so on that, I would like to put more of my focus on that for a moment to see why that would be the case. And I think here we have something that might be useful to us. To
okay, understand. So I did look at your notes, but is there any sense that, as you read it, that he was seeking to stay anonymous to protect himself? Or
well, that's an interesting question, and I won't rule it out. I have to give it more thought to see is that reasonable. On the face of it, it seems like, well, that could be a possibility. Although later in the book, he does give some personal information that might point to him as the author. So if that's the case, then that would sort of gainsay that argument. But I'll think more about that. But it's certainly I'll just say at this moment in time, I would consider it as, okay, that might be a possibility.
I'll let you make your argument, but I think your argument more points toward the assertive nature of the book itself.
Yeah, that's right. So these considerations have to do with two things that I think that are important regarding Paul the man and his, if you want to say, his official status within the body. The first thing is Paul's ministry and primary calling as an apostle was directed not to Jewish brethren, but to Gentiles, wasn't it? We find that in Galatians chapter 2, and in particular in verse 9, where we have discussed there that James, the half-brother of Messiah, Peter, and John, who were regarded as the pillars of the Jerusalem church, they come together, they meet, they sort of, as it were, shake hands and come to an agreement that Paul is going to be the emissary, the apostle, to the Gentile. And they are going to be having their focus of apostolic ministry to the Jewish brethren. And so there's this division that's made, and Galatians is a pretty early book. It may be his first book, but it's certainly early, and most people agree to that. That from the very get-go, in other words, it was understood by the most prominent leaders of the Church of God, of the, if you will, the body of Messiah, that Paul was specifically commissioned to the Gentile world. Now, this doesn't mean that he doesn't have things to say that are very relevant to this Jewish audience.
Certainly.
But he was the leading figure. He was, if you will, the point man, truly, to take the gospel to the Gentiles. So that's a consideration that may be of some usefulness, because Hebrews really, as its name suggests, the audience of this epistle initially was largely Jewish believing brethren. I mean, that was really, and maybe outside of that as well, maybe others in the Jewish community that would have become aware of this work and would have wanted to read it.
So what's the implication? I mean, is it that he didn't want to step on Peter's toes?
Well, it very well could be that his in this sense, that if he felt, he could have very easily have felt that it would not have been appropriate to him, because of the audience to which he was writing, to assert apostolic authority to them.
Okay.
That's entirely possible. It may have been a matter of just personal sensitivity. That he felt, no, wait a minute, no, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, but I do have something important to say, so I won't make it on that basis. I'll make it on the basis that I have something to say that can be evaluated on its intrinsic value. And it will carry authority for that reason. And that gets into the second area, which is that Paul may have, just for that very reason, that the revelation that he's now going to bring forth to this community of believers was, he didn't want it to be construed as resting upon or being validated by his personal authority, but rather on its intrinsic merits. the merits of the arguments themselves, And as we know, in this mix, we have a pretty good idea. Paul was a controversial figure. And you might recall when he returns to Jerusalem in the 21st chapter of the book of Acts, very interesting chapter, Paul, is being surrounded by people within the Jewish community, and I believe probably both believers and unbelievers, that saw him as a renegade, that saw him as saying and doing things that were not in line with standard Jewish orthodoxy, right? In other words, he was, and Paul had to go through a demonstration at that time in meeting with James. A demonstration, by the way, I think that has been largely misunderstood, and would be wonderful to come back and do a podcast on just that alone. What was Paul doing there?
Open invitation, Gary.
Yeah, all right, we'll do it.
Okay.
And so the point is that there was a lot of controversy surrounding him, specifically within the Jewish believing and unbelieving communities. So for that reason, maybe he just decided, I won't put my apostolic stamp of approval on this at the beginning. I'll present the argument and let that sway the audience one way or the other. And I think that argument, personally for me, that argument probably has the most merit. That was intentional.
Reason, sure.
Yeah. I mean, it would be certainly a good, viable reason for not doing that. Now, obviously, when the epistle was brought, there's other evidence that we have that would suggest that they would have known who it was from. That's the thing that because Timothy presumably may have been with Paul or with the author, and they were going to visit the congregations where this was going. So that was the intention. That's part of the sort of personal circumstances that we'll get to a little more fully in a moment. And so those are the things that I think, could easily be a reason why he would have been, shall we say, he's just being somewhat sensitive to the circumstances. And rather than coming forth with his apostolic authority, which he did unabashedly, right, with his Gentile audience, largely Gentile audience. I mean, look, every congregation Paul founded had a contingent of Jewish believers within it, that we know of, in those early days. So he would have been writing both to Jews and Gentiles where he was, but it's in a different context. The context there was Gentiles were coming in; they were coming in fairly significant numbers, and they needed instruction that was particular and peculiar to them as a specific audience, and so and he had something to say that was important for them, that was rooted in his authority as an apostle. So does that help? Then do we answer that?
Yeah, I think so. And if that was the intent, they succeeded.
Yes.
Intrinsic value of the book itself.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean,
no problem.
Yeah, you and I agree that the New Testament would be infinitely poorer, if I can use that term, infinite, and I'm using it more, not in a strict mathematical sense, but you know what I mean,
right?
But infinitely poor without the book of Hebrews in it.
The theological import of what's going on there.
Yes,
and in fact, I rely on that book to tell me what happened with Yeshua as high priest in regard to the Torah and the sacrifices.
Yes.
So I need that book.
Yes, absolutely. It is. It's indispensable in answering some questions that are nowhere else found in the Scripture. I mean, really, but
you're right.
It's in a way that, because, you might say, well, is that a red flag? I mean, you could challenge it as a red flag, right? Oh, it's nowhere else. But when you see how it's reasoned and how those conclusions that Paul or the author of Hebrews comes to, you realize, oh no, it's there. You just didn't see it before. Hebrews reveals it, brings it out into the open.
Oh, it's pointed. Pointed. Where he alludes to it in Romans.
Yeah. Yes.
But then in Hebrews, it explicitly tells me what's going obsolete, who the problem was, what Yeshua came to fix.
Yes,
it's right there.
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly right. It's made very explicit. Good. So the second point then, so that's an answer at least to the introductory part of it. And I trust that we've given, this is like, I hope I've given a sufficient answer to say, okay, yeah, it's an anomaly, but don't let that stumble you. Let's move on. Let's go on to the next things that now begin to become, I think, of more significance in this discussion. So the general style of the book and the information that we have revealed, particularly toward the end of the book, most of it's in chapter 13, are consistent with what we know of Paul. And so there's two references in particular in chapter 13. One is the mention of Timothy, and that's in verse 23 specifically. This author, unknown author, we'll say at the moment, is waiting for the release of Timothy, who apparently has been imprisoned. And the second thing that kind of dovetails with that is it's very clear that this author and Timothy are both presently, at the time of the writing of Hebrews, were in Italy or Rome, perhaps Rome itself. And so, and this we have, by the way, in Philemon. Philemon has several references. The very first verse specifically indicating that Timothy was there with Paul in Rome when Philemon was written. And then we have other verses later in chapter 13 that address Paul's status as a prisoner when he was writing the book of Philemon. So we know at the very least that there was, Timothy was an ever-present person with Paul. The only time he wasn't with Paul, basically, is when Paul sent him out somewhere as his personal emissary to another congregation. Outside of that, Timothy appears to have been a constant companion of Paul's. So the mention of Timothy, particularly in the context of a time period where Paul could very well have been still alive, is very significant. So in fact, I would almost say that basically, if Paul was alive at the writing of Hebrews, the very mention of Timothy almost seals the deal. It's that strong, in my view, that because of their very close association and because, they had a father-son relationship, Timothy went out to the congregations as a representative of Paul, often carrying Paul's direct correspondence and perhaps even his epistles with him to these congregations. And so his position then in relationship to Paul is very strong evidence. And to be frank, we don't have a lot of evidence that there were a lot of other leading figures in the body of Messiah who were in Rome during this period. We do have, traditional claims for Peter, and those traditional claims seem to be strong. I don't know if I'm in a position to evaluate them, but they're strong and they're long-standing. They go back to the very earliest periods of Christianity. But outside of Peter, and maybe I could add, possibly as someone of some note, Priscilla and Aquila, because we know Priscilla and Aquila appeared to have been living in Rome before the Claudius edict that expelled the Jews from Rome, and they appeared to have had a home that they may have very well returned to in Rome in their later life. And so, you could possibly link them in with this category, but you look around and you know what? There's no other evidence I'm aware of any prominent leader, any prominent teacher being in Italy during this period, and
makes sense.
Yeah. And so maybe you could throw in Apollos, but we don't know about Apollos. We know that he was regarded as a very good teacher. He was from Alexandria, and he spent certainly a lot of time in Asia Minor, but I'm not aware of anything that connects him with Italy. So you have these possibilities, right, swirling around, but they're not a lot of them. There's not a lot of options here of somebody who could write an epistle of this magnitude and further, not even identify himself, and it would be readily accepted, because it appears that the book of Hebrews was accepted pretty early by the Christian community. Hebrews 2, verses 3 and 4, which I think I was going to read that. Can find it on here we are, yeah. Suggests that the author, whoever he was, went back to the early days of the faith. And it's stated this way in those verses: how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? God also bearing witness both with signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. And there's a suggestion here that the individual speaking he's not quite a third person to all of this. He's sort of in that category where he seems to be representing himself as one who goes back to the early days, who was familiar with these things from a very early time, was talking with and meeting with and getting at least elements of his gospel from those who had been heard the Lord directly themselves, that kind of thing. So that's the insinuation that's in this verse. At least that's how a number of people have understood it. And so this circumstance would also be consistent with Paul, because Paul was called, we believe, no more than maybe 3 years after the crucifixion. And so that puts him at a very early time in the faith, although he was not an apostle in his earliest years. He took a great deal of time to be trained, as it were, by God through the Holy Spirit, and to be mentored by men like Barnabas, and before he really stepped out into the fullness of his apostolic ministry. So he didn't enter his apostolic ministry immediately, even though when Messiah met him on the road to Damascus, he said, I have called you to proclaim, to the people of Israel, to the Gentiles, and to kings. He didn't take that as, I'm supposed to go immediately, Somehow he was led to understand that no, he needs to be trained, disciplined. He needs a time of discipleship for himself personally, and then he was equipped and prepared to carry forth that ministry. So all of these things at least track with Paul. The things that are revealed.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think, and you've alluded to it as well earlier, that one of the things that's most striking is when you just look at the book, and we'll go into this subject a little more detail in just a moment, that his extensive familiarity with the Tanakh, the Old Testament scriptures, and his very sophisticated use of it. I mean, honestly, there's nothing that compares to Paul when we talk about the use of the Tanakh. Not John, not Peter, nobody is even close to him. And Hebrews is very close to Paul's extensive apprehension, if you will, and comprehension of the Torah. I mean, this is a book that really gets into things that would have required, I believe, a Jewish believer of great learning in the scriptures within the framework of Judaism.
The Day of Atonement was their first rodeo.
That's right.
Many times thought extensively about it.
Yes, that's
and the implications of the Messiah.
That's right. And so if that being the case, and I believe that is, to me, that's almost an incontrovertible statement. As I've gone, and on a personal level, as I've gone through Hebrews, as you know, a number of times and in detail, I come away with that like, wait a minute, this person really knew what they were talking about, and at a very deep level. Sorry, but there's been a few that have suggested maybe a Gentile author wrote it. I think this is highly unlikely.
Yeah,
I really don't see.
And I think every Christian would go, of course, Gary. Every New Testament book, we pretty much understand that they knew what they were talking about. It's by God, for goodness sake.
Yes.
I'll give you for example, having gone through First Thessalonians chapters 3, it's largely introductory material. It's not theologically deep, I wouldn't say, but there's something about Hebrews where you just kind of read it and you go, oh my gosh. This is someone who is getting down to nitty gritty, incredibly clear about what it is that they know. And if there's anything unclear, it's just my inability to fully grasp their grasp. I can't get it. It's not because they're deficient.
Right. The deficiency is ours, and I agree with you wholeheartly.
Yeah.
That's the problem, exactly. Yeah, we just have to try harder, right? We have to dig deeper to get there. So those are the kinds of things that I think do matter. And especially when you're talking about content, content has a role in this discussion. Although as I will talk about again next time, content takes more of a secondary role in the analysis of the text to identify authorship. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting question. Why is that? That might puzzle some of your viewers and listeners. That wait a minute, isn't content everything? It's a very important thing. But it's not everything. And sometimes it can lead you astray. So you have to be careful with content. But on the other hand, when you have content, as you've alluded to, in fact, you took the words right out of my mouth, which is fine. When you have content that is so peculiar, and I don't mean peculiar in an odd way, I mean peculiar in this is really unique. This is really different. This is really deep. This is, that is important. That is an important consideration. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going to get into in just a moment, a little bit of that. I'll just mention two other things real quickly before we move on to what the unique thematic similarities. There are also several expressions in the epistle that are found that occur elsewhere in the New Testament. And some examples of these occur, like he uses a phrase. These are phrases and expressions that are used that oracles of God and milk, like the milk of the word, right? And, that kind of thing, which do appear in other places. Peter uses those expressions, for instance, but they're prominent in Paul, and also there's this in the latter part of the book. I think it's in chapter 10, if I recall, and also in 13, where he uses the expression chains. I'm a prisoners, of the gospel. Those kinds of expressions, which we know are used frequently by Paul. Those come up a lot in his prison epistles and other places where he's using those kinds of expressions. And so again, that by itself is not conclusive evidence. In fact, nothing that we've talked about so far is, but it's sort of the accumulation of it, isn't it? It's when you get, if you want to call it circumstantial evidence, but you get enough of it, you have a harder and harder time dismissing it. I mean, look, detectives use circumstantial evidence at least to identify the suspects, don't they? They may not be able to prove in a court of law that he did it or she did it. Right. But what do they do with circumstantial evidence? They use it to narrow down the field of candidates. That's what they do. Yeah. And so in that sense, I think that this information is useful for that purpose. The ending of the epistle too, again, if you look at how it ends, it really sounds like Paul. It really does. And there are not many cases of these endings outside of the Pauline epistles. There are a few. 1 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John have a sort of similar kind of ending idea where the authors are giving some form of greeting to the recipients, recognition of the recipients, if you will, that kind of thing. But I would urge your readers to just look at those endings and look at all the endings of the epistle of Paul and then Hebrews, and make your own judgment. What does this sound more like? Does it sound more like Peter, more like John, or more like Paul? Or it doesn't sound like any of them, And I would argue that there's a resonance here with Paul distinctively with this ending that really makes it sound like, I could say Paul could have easily written that ending, in other words, that kind of thing. So we have these fragments of evidence in the epistle itself, which all are consistent with Paul and maybe softly point in the direction of Paul. If we had more information, the pointing might be more strong. If we knew more about the exact history and chronology of Paul, in particularly his later years, for instance, we might be able to extract a little bit more information out of this, but we're limited, right? We lack the information to go much further than this. So I won't go much further than this, other than just to say, okay, there's consistency, there's with Paul as the author. Okay, now to unique thematic similarities, and this is where we'll finish today. And I'm going to discuss in detail two of the examples. I actually have 7 that I've identified, 7. And what I'll do is I'll do the first 2 because time will only permit that to really flesh it out in any real detail. But I'm going to share with you that the other 5 examples are very similar to the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about in these first 2 examples. The sort of nature of these very interesting themes that Paul addresses, or the author addresses, I should say, in Hebrews, and that they appear in the Pauline letters, and essentially, and I'll say with quotes on it, exclusively in the Pauline letters. And this is, and I'm going to put quotes around that right now, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a moment. But their exclusive connection to Paul is the thing that's striking. And as we go through some of these arguments and we begin to, and basically I want to do the first 2 in a little more detail because it'll give the audience a feeling for why this is a big deal, okay. As we go through it. And I think you'll almost begin to see Paul in it. It's that big a deal. So these thematic similarities then are things where these are topics, issues that Paul raises that on first glance could even in some cases appear to be almost tangential, but they emerge as being very primary and very important. And it's because of the skill of the author to flesh this thing out the way he does. And this is very similar to what we find in the epistles of Paul, this process of fleshing it out. So we'll go into that now. And So example 1, I refer to example 1 as the quote, the excellent, more excellent, comma, glorious, more glorious principle. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with how Paul compares the nature of the 2 covenants in this respect. And so here we're talking about, if you will, the old covenant. I almost hate to use that term, but the covenant that's original with the Israelites and the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, comparing it with the new covenant, the covenant that he's now made with the body of believers that form his body of Messiah. And in Hebrews, it is specifically stated in chapter 8, and you can look at verse 6 specifically for the citation, and then also kind of gets a little more elaboration in chapter 9, verses 11 and 23. But it's the first covenant is regarded as excellent, but the renewed covenant is more excellent. Mm-hmm. And this idea, I claim, links directly to Paul, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, good part of that chapter, and the reference will be on the slide, that discussion is used to talk about Moses when he comes down from Sinai after having received the law, the glory that Moses had. Right? Mm-hmm. When he comes down and faces the Israelite, they could see the glory of God on his face. Yeah. Paul draws the comparison between Moses, who was glorious, but the Messiah was more glorious.
Amen.
See, this connection. Now, this is fascinating because this idea is only discussed in the New Testament by Paul and by Hebrews. It's unique.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting take on the Old Testament because it was glorious. And today we have too many people running around who do not understand that simple fact. They really do not understand how glorious the old covenant really was.
Yeah.
And so here, I believe that this is a very extremely important concept that we have to have a thorough understanding of. And so what I'd like to do is give you a little backdrop to this concept first, and then we'll kind of wrap this particular example. But I think that there's something that many believers are just not aware of in this view. And this view, by the way, really does reconcile with Paul as a person very well. The more you understand the Apostle Paul and who he was as an observant Jew, you begin to understand why he would speak of this in these terms.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a theme that runs through a number of Paul's writings that provides, I believe, the proper interpretation for this concept. And it's this. Before there can be a resurrection, there must first be a death. That's actually rather logical, isn't it? You know,
I'm buying it.
Yeah. In other words, resurrection doesn't mean very much unless there's a death at some
Sure.
point in this argument. So, and applied specifically to Yeshua, it means that Yeshua had to die before he could be resurrected. Now, knowing that, would anyone like to make the case that Yeshua's sacrifice was in some manner inglorious or unworthy of honor? Well, of course not, because it was absolutely indispensable to our salvation. You know, of course not. Yet it is clear that Paul makes the statement that Yeshua's resurrection was more glorious, because life is always more glorious than death. But death was a necessary first step, prerequisite to the life provided through the Spirit to us and to him, right? In his resurrection. So life has precedence over death, yet death is an essential element of the process for Messiah himself.
Mm-hmm.
And in that manner, he sets the example for us to follow. It's true in our case as well. The terminology is used, in fact, in the 2 Corinthians passage to explain how the two covenants are related to the Torah. You have the letter of the Torah, which points out our sins and thus our existential need for Messiah, right? Because of our sins, we need Messiah and we need his death. It was and still is glorious. It serves a vital function by unmasking our rebellious nature and thereby kills it so that we can be a new creation in the Spirit. That's the message of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, that very famous, we are a new creation in Messiah, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
However, within our new faith in Messiah, we are now ready to allow the Spirit to bring us life, both in the existential sense, that is, because we are saved, and in the way that we walk out the will of God through his commandments by the quickening of our spirit for life in the age to come. This is what Paul is talking about in Romans and what he talks about in his other epistles. You know, that this idea, and I believe this idea lies at the heart of the discussion in Hebrews. It is concerned, of course, primarily in Hebrews with the necessity and willingness of Yeshua to submit himself to the process of death in order to be resurrected and thus qualify to serve as high priest, our high priest. Now, and we talked about this, didn't we, in our Melchizedek series? We spent one entire session on the book of Hebrews itself, talking about this very thing, and how Hebrews goes through, and as you mentioned earlier, makes this very clear. It makes us aware of the deep intricacies of this concept. In Hebrews, Yeshua's very submission to his appointment with death makes possible his resurrection to greater glory. It is this fundamental fact more than anything else that we see illustrated and substantiated by this more excellent principle in describing these two covenants, as explained in the book of Hebrews. See, this is what it's talking about. So the reason a lot of people, don't like this. And there are, I mean, you've read scholarly works on Hebrews, and you know that it abounds with people that they don't like the first covenant being called excellent. They don't like it being called glorious. Oh, that old law, that old covenant, it's a dirty thing that should be just thrown in the trash heap, according to most scholars in certain persuasions of the Christian faith. Yet this is what the author calls it. And in so doing, it's a very similar concept that is raised in Corinthians and in a different way described throughout the book of Romans itself. So that's my first example, that people would begin to understand, wow, there's that much underlying all this? Yes, there is. But to see that, you have to go to the other writings. And this is where I'm finding the other epistles of Paul are informing Hebrews, and the Hebrews is informing the other epistles of Paul in a very natural way. And that's the thing that I want to emphasize. And this is true, by the way, of all the 7 of the examples that I will briefly discuss with you today. That's what happens. There's a kind of synergy, if you will, between the two. And I find that to be significant. I don't think you can gainsay that easily or dismiss it.
Well, just by way of summary, so on the excellent, more excellent, glorious, more glorious principle, yes. I see it just as you've described it.
Yes.
Again, by way of summary, I think in Hebrews 8:8, we find that the reason that the old covenant was obsolete, or even Paul would refer to it as old, is that was the covenant that Yahweh made with the Israelites at Sinai. And because there was a deficiency in one of the covenant partners.
Yes. That's my next point, by the way. That's the next example.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very next example. And that's why I wanted to do these two together, because
then I will stop.
Yeah. I just figured that I'll halt you there because you're segueing very naturally into the second example, which again, and this one's kind of surprising because Hebrews and Paul are the only two entities that make this really explicit in the New Testament. I mean, it's kind of underlying. You can kind of see that, well, it's not that the other people didn't understand sort of this idea, but here in Paul's writings and in Hebrews, it comes right out front and center. But guys, you can't miss this. And he's very clear. And by the way, this clarity is very important. It was important to his audience then. It's important especially today. It's important, especially today, that people understand this. So the second example I'll talk about then is the responsibility for the failure of the first covenant rested solely and entirely with the people of Israel. In other words, God was not at fault. He was not responsible. The law, or the terms, if you will, of the agreement, not at fault. No responsibility there either. That's made clear by Hebrews 8:8, as you pointed out a moment ago. So in other words, the covenant was not flawed, but rather its recipients, the second party in this agreement.
Would you then say the terms of the covenant were not flawed?
Yes, the terms of the covenant. Yeah.
The covenant was flawed in as much as Israel was flawed.
Yes, and I'm glad you clarified that. I should have clarified that too. Yes, the terms of the covenant were not flawed, but it's the fact that the recipients to whom it was given were flawed. Yeah. And it's important to say here that the covenant is not identical to the law. The law is part of the covenant because it's part of the terms of the agreement between the two parties. But covenant in the Hebrew sense is always about a relationship between two parties. Mm-hmm. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
And today we do not understand this. Our understanding culturally and theologically is flawed in this respect by most people. Because, look at our culture. Look where we are today. We are in a situation where covenants have become meaningless between people. Even the marriage covenant, which was once the really vaunted thing, right? Everybody, the marriage covenant, now that's sacred,
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything in our culture anymore. Tell me where a covenant, a bond, a word given by one person to another, an oath, means anything in our culture. Any kind of agreement can't be done with a handshake and a word anymore, right? You got to have a battery of lawyers on both sides to make sure you're protected from one another, protected from from a failure in the agreement of one or both parties. So I would argue that because of this, we use the term covenant and we don't know what we're talking about. Most people, they have no clear understanding how important the word is that's being used there. It's been lost to us in our present culture entirely. And I've discovered that, when we talk about these things, one of the failures of the teaching ministry in the body of Messiah generally, and I'll use this as a very sort of wide sweeping statement, generally in the body, is that we do not make enough time for and enough effort for clarifying the fundamental definition of terms from a biblical perspective. This is one of those terms. There are others, and there are some very important ones. They don't get clarified biblically. And people, often they don't get clarified at all. And people they hear a word and they put their own spin on what the word means, But it's not a biblical definition of the term. We've got to get back to biblical definitions of these terms. They are of extreme importance, because if you get the definition wrong, you cannot possibly come to a truthful, accurate understanding of the meaning and the implications of those words. You are doomed to failure. You are doomed. You're logically doomed. Will come up with
unless you're getting the outcome you want.
Yes, that's right. That's too much of what has happened.
Yeah.
People are feeling free to define these terms. No. You can't do that. You're not allowed. In fact, you put yourself in some peril doing that kind of stuff. You have to get the biblical definition of these terms. You have to understand, what did the writers mean by the term covenant and these other words that we could talk about that have been lost to us in some measure. Sometimes it's wrong, and sometimes it's just incomplete. There are terms that we use and we don't have the full understanding. We have maybe a part of the understanding of it, but we don't have the fullness of it. And we go off spinning all of our little doctrines, with partial information at best, and sometimes wrong-headed information, just a complete misunderstanding of the terms. So I would argue that this is of extreme importance to get this understanding. So for you and I to discuss right now that a covenant is about a relationship between two parties, that is huge in understanding the meaning of the term, both how it's used in Hebrews and how it's used elsewhere in the New Testament. Critical.
Yeah. And again, by way of summary, I think this is important to our present discussion regarding Paul and Hebrews, because this is so much of what Paul wants to explain.
Yes.
He wants to explain the failure of one of the covenant partners, and why the blood covenant in Yeshua's blood, what that meant for all of us.
Exactly. And how it comes up in Hebrews, it's very interesting that what does he do? He quotes at the end of chapter 8, Jeremiah 31, which is one of the primary passages that talks about the new covenant as it would apply to the people of Israel. Now, that covenant, by the way, in its application to the people of Israel has not yet been fulfilled, but it has been fulfilled in the lives of another people who are linked with and bonded to the people of Israel, who are the body of the Messiah. And that's who it's supposed to apply to. When the argument is being made in Hebrews, that a message of the prophet Jeremiah is being used to support the idea that, yes, it will one day be fulfilled in the hearts and minds of the people of Israel. But right now, it's being fulfilled in the hearts and minds of anyone who would embrace the covenant with Yeshua specifically. And so we need to understand that. So that way, when we look at its ultimate fulfillment in the people of Israel, we can begin to get a sense of what it means actually to us today. And I believe that's what the author of Hebrews is trying to get across with this argument. So we look at this and we see that the failure was due to the uncircumcised hearts of the people of Israel. That's why it failed. The uncircumcised hearts. And Paul comes to this theme a lot. Again, it's in Romans a lot. And we find that, Paul is talking about the Jews. He says to them, Jews, if your circumcision is only of the foreskin, guess what? You're not actually circumcised, because it has to be also of the heart. That's what he says in Romans chapter 2 at the end. He's telling the Jews, look, and this is the problem. He's telling the Jews, this is your problem. You did not understand that physical circumcision of itself will profit you nothing unless your hearts are aligned toward fulfilling God's commandments as inspired by the Holy Spirit in accordance with their true and original intent, which they were not doing. This is the entire controversy of the law that Yeshua had with the Pharisees. It's the entire thing. He says, you guys are teaching people wrongly. You're deviating from the original intent of what God had given to the people of Israel. And then you parade and prance around like you're so righteous, but you're not even doing righteousness. You claim to obey God, but you hate your brother. You understand? This is what we're talking about here now. There's a fundamental disconnect that occurred with the Jewish people in relationship to their own law. A fundamental disconnect. It was a primary message of Yeshua's teaching that he castigates especially the Jewish religious leadership as being responsible for this condition.
Okay, Gary. So we see this argument in Hebrews. Are we going to find this argument in other epistles?
Yes. So in Romans, we see elements of it. Let's see if I have I'm just looking here.
What about Galatians 4?
Yeah, that probably is right. For some reason, I didn't include that, and I'm sorry. I just don't seem to have it shown in front of me here, the other reference. I did have a reference there, but I see Galatians 4. I have it referenced to the end of it, where you have the I like to call it the parable of Sarah, Isaac versus Hagar, Ishmael. Yeah, you kind of see it there. And in fact, one of the things that particular parable is supposed to illustrate is the problem with uncircumcised obedience, if I can put that in quotes. In other words, the obedience of the Jewish people was uncircumcised in nature. And what that led to is actually ultimately them persecuting the true followers of God. So that's in Galatians 4, to be sure.
Right.
And so we can see that the end product of all of the experience of the Jewish people ultimately in the first century led them to a state where they did not recognize their Messiah when he came and stood among them. And they ended up persecuting the followers, the people who did. This, I believe, was the final straw that led to their judgment by Rome, through the tool of Rome, in the Jewish revolt in 66 to 70 AD. I believe that specific thing led to their historical downfall, if you will. Now, they will be revived again, and I always have to put that in there because this was, even though a long time, it was temporary. It was not forever. God is going to return and come back, and they're going to be his people again. But Moses predicted this. Moses said there will come a time when you will be so disobedient to God. He mentions this in the Moses song. He mentions it, refers to it in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Other places near the end of his ministry, he comes back to the Jewish people, or to the people of Israel generally, but in our case, I'm going to focus on the Jewish people specifically. And he says to them, you are going to be scattered into the nations, and you're going to go through a very long period of trial because of your disobedience. You see? So this all goes back to the Torah, what we're talking about. The Torah is the foundation for everything prophetically.
All right, Gary. So we are about out of time here. So do you want to cover these examples 3 through 7 now? Do you want to go into your conclusion? What would you like?
Yeah, let's do it. I think I can do it quickly. Obviously, I cannot cover them in detail, but this isn't intended just to give one a flavor of the kinds of things that we're talking about here, and then I can wrap.
Okay.
So example 3, Paul's unique take on Yeshua versus the angels. And I say unique take, not that he was the only one that held this view, but how he expresses it. Angels are ministering spirits that are not to be worshiped, whereas Yeshua is superior to all the angels and is to be worshiped. And though for a brief time he was made a little lower than the angels, he will be exalted to his rightful position next to the Father at his right hand. This idea. See this? Now, it's a little long here, a little longer than the other ones, because I have to flesh it out a little more so people can see, wow, he goes into it in that kind of detail. And I have some references in Colossians, in 1 Corinthians, as well as in Hebrews, where you find this discussed in detail. We'll just probably have to post that so I can move on a little more rapidly here. But those are important ideas, very important ideas. Example 4, Yeshua came down from heaven as a man, lowering himself and even taking upon himself our weaknesses in order to accomplish God's will for our benefit and bring us along with him to a highly exalted state, ultimately in the resurrection. All of that's tied together and is fleshed out in the book of Hebrews in several places, and we find elements of this throughout in Philippians, Ephesians, and Colossians. In those epistles, the same concepts being addressed. And again, this idea and these concepts are unique to Paul, although I will say in John's writings, we find a few echoes of this. But remember, John's writings were written probably either contemporaneously with Hebrews or after Hebrews. And nowhere else in the New Testament do we find anything like this fleshed out in any detail. Example 5, the meaning of the sons of Elohim and Paul's unique, specific elaboration on the concept of our sonship in regard specifically to the God the Father and to Yeshua. And here we find Romans, Galatians, Corinthians. This comes up a lot in different pieces of it, throughout those epistles, where Paul further elaborates on this idea of sonship. And if you look at what's expressed in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 10 to 13, that's an encapsulation almost of these earlier discussions. Yeah, it really is closely linked. Okay.
And for the listener, if you're not able to watch the video, I have all these comparative texts listed for you, so you can go look at Hebrews with these other parallel arguments that the Apostle Paul would be making in other epistles.
Yes, and I would recommend they do that, because actually they may find, hey, it's easier than you think. It's right there. It's not hard to get these things. Example 6, Paul's use of the example of the wilderness wanderings to draw contemporary applications. And that appears in 1 Corinthians, and it appears in Hebrews 3, and a little bit into 4 as well, actually. But Paul is, in Corinthians, uses this, and he uses little bits and pieces in other places as well, but probably the 1 Corinthians 10 is a major passage where he really gets into the fullness of this and shows that. And again, he's the only author I know of that in the New Testament that does this. Example 7, Hebrews 12, 18 to 22 compares Sinai with physical Jerusalem, and in contrast to the heavenly Jerusalem, to the heavenly Jerusalem in a manner quite reminiscent to Galatians chapter 4, that famous parable we referred to earlier, and specifically in verses 24 to 27. So again, here's another little thing. Just interesting, isn't it? I mean, comparing Sinai with physical Jerusalem and the physical Jerusalem contrast to the heavenly Jerusalem. See, we're getting into, again, you'll find an echo of that even in John's revelation and in his writings, but it's just an echo. It's not a fleshing it out. It's not a full development of the subject.
Right.
But in Hebrews and in Paul's epistles, you see much more fleshing out. You get much more fullness in these things. And so those are the examples. There's just 7. There may be more, and every time I read Hebrews, I seem to come up with another one. And in fact, there's one in my mind right now that I'm still kind of working through that I might be able to add to this list. I tell you the truth, I almost hate to upset the perfect 7 here, but but there may be an 8th. Okay,
well, there is an 8th day.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So you have some flexibility there.
Yeah, we have some flexibility here. Yeah. So I'm just, in my reading of Hebrews, these things just sort of leapt out, and it caused me to really think very seriously about, I regard this as for content information, and as a criterion or method for trying to understand authorship. I think that the very unusual nature of these things and the depth, the fact that they are so deep, they are so, if you will, if I can use the term, nuanced theology, mm-hmm. And there's so many of them. I mean, you could argue, I suppose, that if there were only 2 or such thematic parallels, maybe that could be accidental. I would be willing to acknowledge 1 or 2 could be just an accident. But 7 of this nature, now you're beginning to stretch the accidental to incredulity. It really, now you have to really begin to wonder, okay, wait a minute. This person is getting into a depth now, a level. I mean, there's the basic level of theology, right? And then there's that other level. Mm-hmm. We're talking about that other level. We're up here now into something that requires someone of great learning and understanding to be able to extract out of the text of Scripture these concepts and these ideas. So that's why I would say whoever wrote the book of Hebrews had a depth of understanding of the Old Testament that could bring out the truly revelatory nature of the new in its relationship to the old.
Sure,
that's what a lot of these things do, And wow, wouldn't that have been a wonderful gift for someone like the Apostle Paul to have had, especially as he's going into the Gentile world, and the focus of his ministry, you see. So I look at that and I think, man, that is, to me, and I can only speak for myself, is it conclusive proof? Well, conclusive proof is a very tough criteria, isn't it? I mean, that's hard in history, period, right? It's not easy to get conclusive proof in history.
Yeah.
That's the problem, because our information is so sketchy. But you can get a buildup of circumstantial evidence to a point where you start thinking to yourself, it's kind of unreasonable to dismiss this. How could I? Would I dismiss this kind of evidence in any other area of my life? And the answer probably would be no, I wouldn't. I would take it very seriously. So that's kind of where we are with this. And so if Paul was not the author of Hebrews, I'll conclude with this at this juncture. The revelations of these themes and all the other evidence that we mentioned have such a deep personal connection with Paul and his writings, and reveal that the understanding of this hypothetical author was comparable to any other known leader or authority that we know of from the New Testament. So in other words, greater than or equal to any other authority, all right? Whoever wrote this book knew what they were doing, understood the Bible extremely well, and should have been given the honor due him for this. Almost without question, it had to be someone very closely associated with Paul. I think that's very clear. Just if for no other reason. I mean, the timing. I mean, this was still a very new faith when this book was written, right?
Right.
I mean, where is somebody else going to come along on the scene that is essentially of a stature of Paul, not having known Paul, not having been an intimate with Paul, having been maybe even taught by Paul? Where is that going to come from exactly? And I know, yes, the Holy Spirit can do some remarkable things, right? But that's what you're left with. I mean, in any kind of human context, this would make no sense whatsoever. And of course, the people who argue about authorship, what are they arguing from? They're generally arguing from a strictly human context. What's possible, humanly speaking. And we know that there are possibilities that exceed human expectations. But still, it provides, again, if you want to sort of get into this argument on that level. If you want to sort of concede, okay, we'll just take the Holy Spirit out of the equation for the moment. We'll take God out of the equation and just say, on a human level, does this seem reasonable to you? You know, that something like this could happen. And I would say, no, it really doesn't. I certainly, no other circumstance would I regard this as reasonable. So there are some candidates, if what my last statement is true, and one of the ones I didn't mention that we're going to spend a little time with next time that becomes part of the intriguing answer. So I'm going to tantalize your audience with this, is that Luke emerges as a very interesting character in this entire debate, it turns out. Luke does. And we know that Luke was a very close associate of Paul, that he was a constant traveling companion of Paul, and that he too, like Timothy, was with Paul near the end of his life, and so would have been with Paul even perhaps at the time of the writing of the book of Hebrews. So we're going to see how the analysis that was done seems to be pointing us in a very interesting direction to this whole controversy. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, even though Luke is a candidate, I'm going to conclude at this point still that Paul is the person for you, as it is for me. Gary, on behalf of everybody listening and watching, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your brain and really for data people like myself. We'd like to theorize things. We want to know what's going on and be realistic with the data. You're always that. And again, I want to reiterate, why do we do this? We do this because we want to further understand the arguments that the New Testament writers were making, especially in regard to the New Testament, New Covenant, because we've been saved by faith through grace, and we're giving ourselves over to something newer, better, and to know what's going obsolete is the pain effectually caused by uncircumcised hearts. But Yeshua has circumcised our hearts.
Yes, amen.
And now, because of the Spirit indwelling in us, we now approach the Torah with humility, grace, empowered by the Spirit, that we might do it not by going through the motions, but that we might just be obedient people, people that Yahweh is developing for himself. And that's just what we want to do. We want to do it every day of our lives. That's why we call it Everyday Torah.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
We'll see you next time. All right. Ciao.